They say wars are decided on battlefields, but the truth is far darker. The real power lived in silent rooms behind locked doors, where a handful of financial titans decided who would bleed and who would rule. Before we go deeper, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? And if you're ready for a story hidden behind every empire's rise, hit like, share this with someone who loves history, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear was never meant for the public. For nearly 2 centuries, global warfare had 2 fronts. The visible one, where soldiers marched, and the invisible one, where bankers and financiers calculated the cost of victory. Armies could not move without rifles, rifles could not exist without factories, and factories could not operate without money. And so, in the shadows of Europe and America, a small council of financial families formed. Families who did not swear allegiance to any king or government, but to something far more enduring: profit, influence, and survival. The kings of the age needed them more than they needed kings. They were the invisible arteries that kept warfare alive. Some rulers feared them, others begged them, all depended on them. And yet, the world remembers the generals, not the men in smoke-filled rooms who approved the loans that made generals possible. Imagine this: a monarch pacing his private chamber, armies mobilizing on the borders, threats rising like storms across Europe. But he cannot commit to war, not truly, until one thing happens. He receives a discreet letter or a coded message from one of these financial dynasties, informing him whether credit will flow or whether the treasury will remain dry. In that moment, the fate of nations hung not on strategy or honor, but on the handwriting of a banker. It did not matter how noble a cause seemed. Without funds, wars collapsed before they began. And so, subtly, quietly, the Backroom Kings began choosing which wars deserved to exist. These were families with networks that spanned continents, institutions embedded in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, New York. Their reach crossed borders with a speed no army could match. They could send encrypted messages faster than diplomatic couriers, assess political risk before ministers even understood it, and hedge against outcomes while nations were still arguing about whether to mobilize. Their neutrality was an illusion. They followed patterns of opportunity. Instability meant lending. Lending meant influence. Influence meant leverage. And leverage meant a form of power no emperor could openly admit existed. By offering credit to one nation and quietly restricting it to another, they tilted the balance of history without ever stepping onto a battlefield. In the 19th century, this power grew to unprecedented levels. While Europe erupted in conflicts, the Napoleonic aftermath, the unifications of Germany and Italy, the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Backroom Kings found their seats growing heavier with responsibility and reward. They financed reconstruction, stabilization, modernization, but also escalation. Each major conflict required staggering sums of money, and these families were the only ones capable of providing it without collapsing under the strain. They traded in war bonds, national debts, international currencies, and in the political futures of rulers themselves. Governments whispered about them behind closed doors, often with resentment, always with dependence. As the world entered the 20th century, modern warfare exploded into existence, and with it came an astronomical rise in financial needs. Machine guns, dreadnought battleships, rail mobilization, telegraph infrastructure, artillery lines stretching across nations. The cost of war multiplied like wildfire. But even then, nations rarely had the funds ready. Taxes could not rise quickly enough. Reserves drained too fast. Political approval lagged behind military urgency. In this void, the Backroom Kings tightened their circle and became something else entirely: an unofficial war council. Kings, presidents, prime ministers all came to them, not by force, but by financial gravity. At times, these families operated independently. At other moments, they cooperated in astonishing secrecy. They shared risk, divided regions, influenced bond markets, and predicted geopolitical outcomes with near-prophetic accuracy. Their analysts were often far sharper than government intelligence agencies, because money, unlike ideology, demanded precision and foresight. If a nation showed signs of internal weakness, they saw it in the credit data before newspapers caught a whiff of unrest. If a ruler was unstable, they sensed it from his spending habits. If a war would drag on, they knew before the generals did, simply by observing how quickly armies burned through cash. But this power came with consequences: consequences the public would rarely understand. When you control the flow of credit, you indirectly control when wars start, how long they last, and sometimes even how they end. A government cut off from funding collapses. A general with empty coffers cannot advance. A navy without capital cannot build ships. And so history shifted not only because of military strength, but because of decisions made in quiet rooms where ledgers replaced maps and interest rates replaced gunpowder. The Backroom Kings were neither heroes nor villains. They were survivors of a system they helped shape. The most unsettling truth was that these families did not view wars through emotional lenses. They studied them through economic logic: risk, return, stability, disruption, balance of power, long-term geopolitical consequences. They evaluated loss of life in terms of national capacity to recover loans. They measured territorial shifts in terms of future investment opportunities. It wasn't cruelty, it was the cold mathematics of global finance. And while rulers feared losing power, the Backroom Kings feared something else entirely: losing influence. So long as nations needed money, they would remain indispensable. When World War I erupted, their role expanded even further. The scale of the conflict was so massive that no nation could afford to sustain it alone. Supplies, ammunition, food, medical equipment, transport, all demanded credit lines that stretched across oceans. While troops marched across trenches, these financial dynasties watched bond markets oscillate like cyclones. When the United States entered the war, America's own financial houses rose and joined the circle, shifting the global center of economic gravity for the next century. Wars were no longer European. They were global financial events. Through all of this, these families maintained a delicate posture, always present, never visible. They met in private dining rooms, grand halls, seaside villas, underground vaults, or remote estates inaccessible to the public. They wrote letters coded with innocuous language. They negotiated terms through intermediaries. They maintained the world's most guarded informal alliance, not written in any constitution, not bound by any flag, but held together by shared interest and the unspoken understanding that their influence depended on secrecy. If the world ever realized just how much of warfare depended on them, public outrage could have shattered their legitimacy overnight. Yet their influence is not a fairy tale or a myth. It is the uncomfortable truth of how modern states function. Nations require funding, just as engines require fuel. Wars amplify that need exponentially. And because governments cannot print wealth out of thin air, they turn to those who can provide capital quickly, decisively, and intelligently. The Backroom Kings were not monsters. They did not create wars. They simply operated within the reality that war, for centuries, was one of the most powerful economic engines on Earth. And in operating it, they shaped much of the world we live in. But the real story, the one far more complex, far more revealing, far more unsettling, lies in the families themselves, the decisions they made, the alliances they formed, the political storms they navigated, and the hidden battles they fought, not on fields of blood, but in the vaults of finance. That story begins with the rise of the world's most powerful financial dynasties. They always hid behind polished desks, behind signatures that looked harmless, behind diplomatic smiles that never revealed the truth that every loan they approved chained nations into obligations they could never escape. And as the wars dragged on and casualties grew, these quiet financiers didn't flinch. They studied numbers instead: interest schedules, debt maturities, collateral options, post-war reconstruction bonds. You would think they were analyzing wheat harvests or railway expansions, not deciding how many young men would die in the next offensive. And yet, behind the scenes, politicians came begging to them. Generals waited on their approval. Kings and presidents whispered their names only in private chambers. They weren't elected, they weren't crowned, but their influence was more enduring than any political dynasty. Because governments rose and fell, but debt endured, and the Backroom Kings mastered it fully. What people today still don't realize is that these men didn't merely react to wars. They structured them. They shaped when they would begin, how long they would last, and when they would be allowed to end. Peace was not a moral decision. It was an economic equation. If the loan cycles still had room for profit, if the wartime interest had not reached its peak, negotiations were conveniently delayed when treaties were finally drafted. The Backroom Kings guided them like unseen architects, ensuring that whatever reparations or territorial changes were agreed upon would require yet another round of loans. They engineered a world where conflict was not an interruption to stability, but a business model, and nations, blinded by desperation or overconfidence, kept feeding the machine. By the early 20th century, the system had become so polished that war financing was practically automated. If one empire needed weapons, another needed supplies, and a third needed to stabilize its currency. The Backroom Kings approved the flow of money from one side to another, often funding enemies simultaneously. Not because they were ideologically aligned with anyone, but because chaos created leverage, and leverage created opportunity. Wars were storms, and they were the kings of the wind, directing where the pressure would rise and where it would collapse. Some governments slowly realized they were being played, that every attempt to break free from these financial networks only dragged them deeper into dependency. But by then, it was too late. Their national budgets were built on debt, their military expansions funded by foreign credit, their political futures tied to financial obligations they couldn't repay. When you examine the documents today, the correspondence, the memos, the private letters, you see a pattern. Leaders spoke boldly in public, but in private, they wrote with fear. They knew the real power didn't sit on thrones or in parliaments. It sat around long wooden tables behind closed doors, discussing not ideologies but returns. When a country lost a war, the Backroom Kings did not lose with them. They simply shifted portfolios, purchased debts at discounted rates, and financed the reconstruction. When a country won, the kings still collected, because victory required new roads, new factories, new banks, all funded by loans with elegant interest curves that guaranteed they would profit no matter the outcome. Victory and defeat were illusions. Balance sheets were the only truth. And yet, despite all this influence, they never appeared in the spotlight. No statues, no public honors, no historical speeches. Their legacy was deliberately invisible, but their fingerprints are on every major conflict of that era. Every time a battle erupted unexpectedly, every time a truce collapsed, every time negotiations failed at the last moment, someone somewhere approved a transfer, extended a loan, or denied one, pushing the world 1 inch closer to chaos. And nations convinced they were acting out of honor or strategy never realized they were walking along paths drawn by men who never stepped foot on the battlefield. The Backroom Kings didn't command armies, they commanded consequences. Even today, the echoes of their decisions shaped global systems. Entire economies still operate on principles they engineered. Credit cycles, wartime bonds, sovereign debt management, these structures didn't appear naturally. They were designed by people who believed the world wasn't divided by borders but by liabilities. They created a global architecture where no nation is ever truly independent, where the cost of conflict is always higher than expected, and where the price of peace is often written in contracts that no civilian ever gets to see. Their power didn't come from force. It came from understanding how to turn national desperation into generational wealth. And as you reflect on all this, one question lingers. If unseen financial networks shaped the wars of the past, who shapes them now? Who signs the papers that determine what nations fear, pursue, or avoid? Who sits in rooms the public will never enter, deciding the price of a soldier's life, not in ideology, but in interest rates? History repeats itself, not because people forget, but because the architects behind the curtain never change their methods. They simply upgrade their tools. If you've stayed with me this far, you're the kind of person who doesn't accept the shallow version of history. You look deeper, you think sharper, and you question what others overlook. So before you go, like this video, share it with someone who loves the hidden side of history, and subscribe so you never miss the next truth they don't teach in textbooks. Let's uncover the next shadow empire together.